Hi guys, another biology with Miss Cherry. Today we're moving away from the genetic stuff even further and we're going to start looking at how populations change over time. So have a look at the diagram for me. What is speciation? What does the picture show? And how do you think each beak came about? So we're only focusing on the beaks, look at the food sources, look at the habitat, and consider how each of these individuals has come from this initial population of the seed-eating groundfinch. If you're not sure where I got that information from, it's part of that key down there. So spend a few minutes, pause, and then over the course of the lesson, we will hopefully answer all of those questions. So this is lesson 7.13, isolation and speciation. We're very near the end of module 7 now. We've only got about 4 more lessons left, but as you can see, it's quite a detailed one today. This topic doesn't really link to anything that we've done so far, but it links quite heavily to the stuff that you've done about evolution at GCSE. So we're going to be looking at the change in allelic frequency and how that influences speciation, and then looking at the 2 different types of speciation, allopatric and sympatric speciation, as well towards the end of the lesson. Throughout it, there's going to be quite a few independent tasks for you to do, because otherwise listening to me for an hour is going to be boring. So let's get started. So we're going to start by thinking about gene pools and allelic frequency at a very basic level. So this is our first question for you guys to think about. What happens to alleles of 2 individuals if they have a baby? Literally, what happens? And then how does that affect the frequency of these alleles, or the allelic frequency of them in the gene pool? So pause, have a couple of thoughts, and then play again when you're ready. Now those alleles of the 2 individuals, the parents, are passed on. The gametes fuse together to form an embryo, and then the embryo goes to form a fetus as it develops. And what that's going to do is it's going to increase the allelic frequency of those 2 parental alleles in the gene pool. Remember, that gene pool is the combination of alleles in a population in an area. And therefore, theoretically, any sexually mature individuals, i.e. reaching puberty, can reproduce. But why is that not always going to happen? Why might some individuals not pass on their alleles? Why might they not reproduce? We've got things like selection pressures that are going to impact the likelihood of 2 individuals mating. And in module 4, we looked at reproductive behaviours, things like plumage, things like mating dances. And all of those are going to affect the likelihood of mating pairs being joined together, I guess. But additionally, if one individual lacks an advantageous allele, so maybe a really jazzy plumage, maybe a fun coloured tail, they might not be as attractive to the other members of the species, and therefore reduce the likelihood of them mating and passing on that allele. Now, what's important to know, and this is key, so I need you to make a note of this, is that selection pressures do not have any impact on the likelihood of a mutant allele arising, so that spontaneous formation of the alleles. Okay, those are just errors of meiosis. Maybe the organisms, as they're reproducing, have come into contact with a water-based mutagen, for example. We can't control that. That's not a selection pressure. That's not going to have an impact on mutation incidents. However, selection pressures themselves alter the frequency that an allele will appear in a gene pool. So by it, I mean the allele in a gene pool, and this over time gives us evolution. And we have to be quite specific here in the exams. Evolution by natural selection. A natural selection implying that selection pressures have had an impact on the passing down of the alleles over time. Now I want you to go back to the very beginning of the lesson. How did you define speciation? Because all we've spoken about so far is evolution. So the process of those selection pressures changing the allelic frequency of certain genes, and over time organisms as a population will change. But speciation is slightly different. It's still related to evolution, and you should have seen it in that diagram of Darwin's finches. Speciation is in fact the evolution, so the formation of a new species from pre-existing ones. And we saw in that diagram that that initial ground-feeding, seed-eating finch, the little brown one in the middle, gave rise to all of those different individual types of finches. And remember our definition of species from everything that we've ever done before, that are individuals within a population with a common ancestry. So thinking back to where you've looked at things like the phylogenetic trees, you've looked at kingdoms, phylums, orders, class, genus, species, dear King Philip, come over for great spaghetti, all of that stuff. Those individuals in that population can reproduce with each other and form fertile offspring. And remember that fertile offspring is key. It means that they can have babies. And ultimately, that is going to be the bit that carries on passing the alleles on. Now, speciation occurs through a couple of various mechanisms that we're going to have a look at today. So we're looking at allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. But the two populations, or the new species that are produced, become what we call reproductively isolated. And that just means that they are so genetically different. So we say that they are distinct species or genetically different, that they can't interbreed anymore. So whereas previously, historically once, they might have been able to, and one might have just had a funny looking eye, now they're so different genetically that chromosomally it wouldn't work. Now it's your turn to do something because I've been speaking for a while. Have a look at the snippets of page 196, 197 on OneNote for me, or you can use the revision guide link that I put on Teams. It might not have exactly the same information, but hopefully you should be able to fill the gaps out, and this will give you the basics of speciation. So you can pause and play again when you're ready. So here we are then. Here's the process of speciation. So populations of species sometimes show genetic variation, and that might be through mutation, that might be through change in selection pressure. If you think about the peppered moth, for example, the selection pressure changed to mean that the darker wings were slightly more advantageous at the time, and so over time the species is going to move towards the darker phenotype. Now sometimes populations will become isolated, so that means that they will become restricted in their movement through geographical means. So maybe things like rivers, mountains, or big caverns, things like valleys, for example. And they might develop different mutations. Again, this is just a spontaneous event. But sometimes, because of that difference in where they live, those different alleles, the mutations, become advantageous. Okay, they become a little bit more useful to that population. And then we start getting a genetic distinction. We start moving away from that original population genetic and instead start transitioning towards a new species. Now, the natural selection process, we know, is going to have an impact on the allelic frequency, and that's going to be impacted again by selection pressures of this new environment. So this could be something like food source, it could be something like habitat, it might also be because of things like predators that mean that maybe some organisms that are able to hide a little bit better can survive. And therefore the combination of advantageous alleles in each population is different because they've got different things that they need to worry about. And this process is called adaptive radiation. They are adapting to their environment. And radiation implies that we're moving away, so we're spreading away from that central point. And over time, this is going to give us a change in allele frequency between each of those distinct populations until eventually those individual populations become genetically isolated. They're too genetically different, so they can't interbreed, and they are distinct species. And in doing that, they become part of the same genus. Okay, so they'll still have the same first name in terms of things like Homo sapiens. Okay, so they'll still be part of the Homo genus, but not homogenous then, Homo genus. But they'll have a different bit at the end. And that difference, compared to the original, is speciation. They're a new species. Now, genetic drift plays a part in speciation, and it's a change in allelic frequency due to a random chance event, something that's uncontrollable. Maybe it's a tornado, maybe it's someone swatting the ladybirds at the bottom. But what is that swatting of the ladybirds at the bottom an example of? What kind of relationship between organisms is that? Now, hopefully you would have said a predator or a hunting kind of event down at the bottom. We've swatted almost all of the blue ladybirds. Now, what is that going to do to the allelic frequency of the different colours of shell, I guess, in that ladybird phenotype, in that ladybird population? And hopefully you should be able to see that despite being an initially equal society, if we're hunting the blue ones, or maybe the blue ones provide a disadvantage, they're not as evolutionarily advantageous, then over time, through periods of reproduction, the red phenotype becomes more common. And that in turn is going to increase the allelic frequency of that red phenotype in the population. Now, genetic drift and these small random chance events have obviously a more significant effect on small populations. You saw there in that ladybird example that if we've got populations of few individuals, so less than maybe 10, there's less genetic diversity. You saw there that they were either blue or red. And if we get rid of some of the blue body ones, for example, that's going to have a significant effect on the population as a whole. And we saw there that where we wiped out 4 out of 5 of the blue body ones, in the next generation, there were now 10 red and only 2 blue. And that's going to have a really significant effect on the gene pool of that population as a whole. Any mutations, therefore, that arise in a small population, so maybe if that blue one that survived suddenly turned green, is going to be able to pass on quickly and have a bigger impact in future generations. And ultimately, that is going to give us the rapid evolution of a phenotype in a population if that mutation is really, really good. So maybe actually green ladybirds that blue one has mutated into can't be hunted as effectively. Maybe the thing that's swatting them is green colourblind. I don't know. It's just an example, but you've got to think about these things, that maybe a change isn't always bad. A mutation doesn't have to be problematic all the time. Now, if mutations have a significant effect on phenotype in a small population, so that ladybird example, why is it not as great an impact in large populations? And I want you to use those 2 key words at the bottom. So pause, have a go at writing a couple of sentences, and then play again when you're ready. Now, hopefully your sentences should have looked a little bit like this. So in larger populations, there's a larger gene pool, which means that despite a mutated allele being present, it's going to have a lower allelic frequency overall. So it's a bit more what we call diluted or genetically diluted between all of the other alleles in that population. And those other alleles in the population in that gene pool might be much more significant as a part of that pool. And therefore these new mutations are going to have a much lesser effect. They're not going to be as impactful in changing the phenotype of the population as a whole. Now, the first type of speciation that we're going to look at is allopatric speciation. You need to be able to spell this. And in some cases, this might be called geographic speciation or isolation speciation. We need to call it allopatric speciation. And this is where only some members of an original population are geographically isolated by a physical barrier. It has to be a tangible barrier, something that restricts movement. And this physical barrier, so seas, rivers, mountains, prevent populations interbreeding. And I want you to think, how might things like seas, rivers, mountains cause different species to develop? Now, Darwin's finches is a perfect example of this allopatric speciation in action. So Darwin's finches all originally colonised a central Galapagos island, and they all became seed-eating ground finches. There was no competition, got loads of these finches, but over time the population got a little bit too big. So a few generations later, when the population became a little bit too vast for that small island, food was in short supply, space was becoming a bit of an issue, there was too much intra-species competition, finches started to move away. They started to migrate and go to different islands within the Galapagos archipelago. But this gave us a little bit of a problem, and you can see down in the key at the bottom that there was a little bit of an issue. Now, all of these different finches that have developed over time originally came from that initial seed-eating ground finch that we've spoken about. And you can see that on each of those islands, there's going to be a different food source. So some had insects, some had birds and fruit, some had cacti and cactus seeds, and some just stayed the standard seeds. That's fine, we know how to deal with seeds. But over time, that food source became the selection pressure. And over time, mutations in beak shape happened. Yeah, random mutations through meiosis, through the fusion of gametes. And you can see now that each of these different food sources has very different shaped beaks. So the ones that still eat seeds have quite scooped beaks, for example, whereas the ones that rely a lot more on insects for a food sample have slightly more pointed and narrow beaks, almost to do a little bit more of a jabbing motion. Now, the better shaped the beak for the food source, the more advantageous it's going to be, the more likely that that individual is to survive and reproduce and then pass on the alleles, and therefore the higher that beak's allelic frequency in the gene pool of that population. Remember, by the population, we're talking about the individuals on the specific islands. Over time, though, these little changes in the beaks started to become genetic distinctions. The populations had started to adapt to their environment so well that they'd become speciated, or they'd developed into individual species. And therefore, key thing, summary sentence on every question about speciation, the populations were no longer able to interbreed. That is key. So a bit like when we do the chi-squared test, you have to always start with your null hypothesis. With speciation questions, you always need to finish by saying that the populations are no longer able to interbreed. Now it's your turn. In as few words as possible, see if you can get it under 10. No, under 20, that might be better. See if you can summarise allopatric speciation nice and concisely for your notes. The second type of speciation is sympatric speciation, and this is occurring between individuals that share the same habitat. So they occupy the same space, maybe they share land and supplies, and this is much less frequently occurring than allopatric speciation, and it's a lot more difficult for animals to undergo this type of speciation. It occurs a lot more frequently in plants, and this is generally occurring when two different species interbreed to form infertile offspring. So they're reproductively isolating themselves that way. And this new species has got a completely different number of chromosomes to either of its parents. So maybe if one parent's got 4 chromosomes and the other's got 6, this new species might have 5. And therefore, this new plant is unable to breed with either parent population. Now that's going to restrict my gene flow, or the flow of alleles from population to population, and ultimately reproductively isolates that hybrid. And hybrid, if you're not too sure, just means the blend or the combination of those two different parent species. Now I want to spend some time looking at this whole process of sympatric speciation and thinking at the beginning why plants are able to form these hybrids much more easily and frequently than animals do. Think about the whole process of plant reproduction. How does one of the plant ova get fertilized? Why is it completely random? And the fact of the matter is that pollen is just completely released into the wild. It's indiscriminate. It's not going, oh, like that plant, chuck it over there. No way. It's just released into the air and it gets blown around, or it gets transported on the legs or bodies of insects that transfer from plant to plant. And at this time, we've got the passing on of pollen to another plant, production of a hybrid. That means that even in that area where both parents are found, it still can't reproduce despite coming from that original population. And we can see in the diagram that we've got key examples here of this reproductive isolation, this sympatric speciation happening. So original parent populations of einkorn wheat with different alleles, so A's and B's, are both diploid. They're both 14 chromosomes. But what they produce, Emma and durum wheat, is tetraploid now, which means that it's got far too many chromosomes to go back and reproduce with those parent populations. But that tetraploid population of Emma and durum wheat is able to cross with goat grasses, which has got fewer genetics. Yeah, it's only a diploid species, but can reproduce and form bread wheat. Now, bread wheat is hexaploid, means it's got 6N, or 6 lots of the copies of the chromosomes that we need. Problematic because this hexaploid individual, the bread wheats, cannot reproduce with any of the species that it has been effectively made from. And in turn, it means that bread wheats can only ever reproduce with bread wheats, and that stops any kind of further evolution. And what we can see happening here, bread wheats is modern wheat. These are what we use now to make things like our standard white sliced. But actually, these new einkorn wheats, or these old einkorn wheats and Emma and durum wheat and things like that, are now like hipster foods. So people pay a lot of money to have breads that are made with these ancient grains. That's how they market them. Ancient grains. Ooh. But now it's your turn again. I've put some photos on OneNote of the apple maggot fly. I would like you to tell me how that is an example of sympatric speciation. And then for each type of variation in table 1, summarise its effect on the population. So again, those are photos. Have a look at those. And then find an example of an organism that is affected by each type of isolation. So we've spoken about a few. Hopefully through your own tasks this lesson you will be able to do that quite quickly. And another independent task, because as you know, all work is homework now, so scribble that out. So this is relating to page 202 to 203. And it's another couple of tasks for you guys to do. So a little bit of independent reading, defining any new keywords, because remember you need to keep turning over that keyword sheet. We should be nearly at the bottom of it now. And then a diagram to show how keywords are interlinked. So things like gene pool, allele frequency. You can just, a bit like if you do chemistry, you put the reagents and the conditions on the arrows. You can just draw links between those keywords in a nice big flow to show how words relate to each other and how you could link them in a sentence. Now finally, we're going to finish off with some exam questions. You know we love that. So test yourself. Diagrams A to E below show the heads of 5 species of finch inhabiting a volcanic oceanic island in the Galapagos group. The Galapagos Islands lie about 600 miles from the South American mainland. What major difference between the 5 species is shown in the diagram? 1 mark, should only be a couple of words. How might this difference that you mentioned in part A be related to the habits of the finches? So you can pause now. This is about 3 marks, so it should take you a couple of minutes. And then question C, Darwin suggested that these finches probably descended from a common ancestral stock of finches. Suggest how these ancestral finches may have reached the Galapagos. And it's a how. How might they have got there? Part D, suggest how the modern diversity of finches arose from the ancestral stock. So how did we get those changes? It's a 4 marker. It needs to be detailed. Think of your keywords. That's why we link them. The different finch species on the island do not interbreed. What does this suggest? So again, thinking back to what we've done today and linking in the ideas. And the final question. The plumage of the different finch species present is very similar. suggest two ways in which the males and females of the same finch species may recognise each other. So they all look very similar. How could we tell the difference between them? And then we'll go through the answers on the next slide. So the differences that you should have seen are the shape of the beak, and this is because of their different diets. So you could have said that some eat insects, some eat seeds. I'll accept if you'd said some eat things like cacti. And the beaks become adapted over generations by variation mechanisms. Now the way that those finches, could have got there is that they have come from the South American landmass. Remember, it told you in the question that it's about 600 miles from South America. And you could have mentioned that they've flown there, but 600 miles is a long way to go. So realistically, we're looking at storms on winds, or that they're carried on driftwood, so carried through something floating in the sea. Now, the way that these differences arise is due to mutations that occur during meiosis, maybe fertilisation, and those mutation processes continue. The most successful variations will survive better and over time reproduce, and you could have made any reference to different niches, so different specific environmental areas which birds might become adapted to. The idea that they can't interbreed tells you that they are now separate species, and this is due to that reproductive isolation. You could have said it's allopatric speciation as well, that would have been fine. And the way that two birds that are of the same species might be able to recognise each other, aside from that plumage, is maybe bill shape or beak shape, the song that they sing, the mating dances, or any movements that they might have done to sort of attract a mate. And now this last question is quite a tricky one, and sometimes in an exam they might give you a question like this where you have to link the keyword to the definitions on the paper as well. So have a go. You're going to pause now. You're going to need to read through all of these carefully and decide which keyword from the box up here, so which evolutionary term links with the key definitions A through to J. So pause. I would expect at least 5 minutes on this to think about it, and play again when you're ready. So here we are. Check your answers. If there's anything you aren't sure about or you want clarifying, please ask me now. So I was B, I-I-D, then A, G, C, F, I, E, J and H. Now give yourself a score out of 10, and if you didn't get any of those, go back to your keywords and define them. If there's any words that you haven't seen before, add them to the bottom of your keywords list. That's absolutely fine. You'll notice that they're all Word documents, so you can just copy it into your own area and add another row. That's fine. I hope you found this useful. If you've got any questions, please ask. If you need any help with anything, please ask as well. Send me an email, pop up on chat, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.